Hey, welcome to Furthering Christendom. It's been a little bit since made one of these. Sorry for those who were waiting on an episode that I have here with Gaven Kerr as my guest today. I got a concussion, so I was making lots of videos for Furthering Christendom, and then I fell down the stairs and I was out for a little bit, but thankfully all better. And Gavin has kindly come back on, rescheduled with me. And so, Gavin, how you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Not as bad as you with your concussion and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm doing grand. It's the end of the day for us. It's nearly 9 o'clock over here. So yeah, getting to the end of it. So it's nice to do stuff like this just to wind down, just before we turn in for the evening. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
hmm
Um, well, thanks for coming on. I wanted to
hmm
talk with you about um, some existential inertia stuff, some survivalism stuff. We got to hang
mm
out last November, I believe,
mm Yeah.
in New Orleans, and
Mm.
kind of got to chop it up a bit there. And I thought it would be also good to do so currently. By the way,
Mm.
though, when I did break my rib and got a concussion, I
Mm.
thought, man, I wish I was a fighter. This would have been so much of a better story. But
Yeah, well, I mean, just after my fight in December, I was kind of hanging out here and it was pretty icy, and I fell, landed on my face, had a
mm,
huge black eye, pretty sure I was concussed as well. And it was just after the fight, so everybody saw me and they thought, he got that from the fight. Yeah. So, I mean, I got pretty, mangled up, not from fighting, but, from a fall as well. So,
you're just like you should see the other guy, right?
you don't have to be a fighter to get a concussion or a black eye or whatever. Yeah. So,
Awesome. All right.
yeah.
So essence is obviously distinct from existence, right?
hmm
Think of Aquinas's example of a phoenix or whatever.
Mm.
Obviously has an essence but doesn't exist, or Pikachu has
Yeah.
an essence but doesn't exist.
hmm
Uh, so you might argue like, okay, well, it seems like in order for an essence to exist, right, it has to participate. It depends on existence, right, the sheer act of existence. And so you might think, well, what is this dependence relationship, right?
hmm
What is this
Yeah.
dependence relation?
Mm.
Um, does this dependent relation require a concurrent sustaining cause? And if so, does that beg the question against the individual who endorses existential inertia,
Mm.
right? And
Yeah.
if you say, well, no, a concurrent sustaining cause is not assumed,
hmm
then it seems like there are existentially inertia-friendly versions of dependence that are consistent with saying that um, uh, the essence depends on existence.
Yeah.
So,
hmm
can you kind of uh, help me out here? How are we help the watcher? Right, I
hmm
believe you, Gavin.
Mm.
I'm with
Yeah.
you,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
for the random observer watching right now,
Mm. Yeah.
how is it not begging the question against EI by saying that
Mm.
there's a need for a concurrent sustaining cause for
Yeah.
essence to exist?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing to say is it would only be begging the question if it assumes what it seeks to prove. And let's say, in this case, it assumes that EI isn't the case. It would be begging the question if it assumes that. But begging the question is when you assume what you seek to prove. The whole metaphysics of essence and existence is not seeking to prove that existential inertia is not the case. So it's not assuming that existential inertia is not the case and thus concluding it's not the case. Because the whole point is not to show that existential inertia is not the case. It's to show what the metaphysics of essence and existence is. And once we lay that out, then we see that existential inertia is, excluded from that. So existential inertia isn't on the radar. It's not until we kind of, do out the metaphysics of essence and existence that we see, oh, as a consequence of this, existential inertia is either included or not. So it's the metaphysical commitments that it's the metaphysics that we're committed to prior, which is going to determine where we stand, one way or the other, on existential inertia. That
So
being the
look,
case, mhm.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So were you going to say something?
I
Yeah.
was just going to say, so when it comes to this, when it comes to building our ontology or metaphysics of existence,
Hmm.
you argue against Quine,
Hmm.
Russell, Frege, you
Yeah.
argue against David Lewis, right? You argue
Yeah.
against these types of metaphysics of existence, and you're
Mm.
arguing against them in a positive way, independent of
Mm.
concerns about EI.
Mm.
But nonetheless, after you sort of show that these other models of existence aren't good or
Mm.
fail to capture certain important intuitions,
Mm.
well, then you have our model for existence, and it just so happens that this model of existence entails a rejection of EI. Is that kind of what you're saying?
No, no, not
Oh,
exactly. I
okay.
mean,
Okay.
the engagement with different accounts of existence is an engagement with what is existence. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
what is the metaphysics of existence? When it comes to the rejection of existential inertia, that pertains to how essence and existence are related to each other. So, having rejected, Russell, Quine, Wittgenstein, Lewis, or whatever accounts just of existence qua existence, we're left with the Thomist view of existence qua act, qua principle of actuality, which actualizes the essence. And it's in that relationship, as you opened up with, it's in how essence and existence are related to each other, which excludes existential inertia.
Got it.
So yes, it is to do with the prior metaphysics we're committed to, but it comes a little bit more, sort of down the line after that.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Hmm.
Absolutely. I think that's helpful.
So that kind of gets us in then to that relationship of essence and existence, because I said that, existence is the principle which actualizes essence. Okay, so essence stands in potency to existence, and essence is not actualized without the act of existence.
Right.
In the same way that matter is not actualized without some form. So, we have an actual clump of matter once it's formed in some sort of way. So we don't have an actual, essence there in the world unless it's actualized some way by the act of existence. But in the same way that the matter participates in the form in order to be the clump of matter that it is, so too the essence participates in its existence in order to be the essence that it is. And then following on from that, were the form not to be continually present in the matter would simply have no form.
Mm-hmm.
So similarly, were the act of existence not to be continually present to the essence would simply not be. So the
Mm-hmm.
principle of actuality is that which posits a subject there to begin with. It's not something that resides in a subject, it's what posits the subject. An inertial property resides within a subject, presupposes a subject in which to reside. It doesn't posit a subject. That's precisely why it's inertial. You've got a subject there which subsists. The inertial property subsists in it, and so long as the subject subsists, the inertial property will subsist.
Mm.
But the principle of actuality is what posits the subject there complete in the first place. The form positing the chunk of matter as the chunk of matter that it is, the act of existence positing the essence as the essence that it is. Without those principles of actuality, you would have no subject within which properties could subsist.
Right.
So the principle of actuality is the condition for subsistence, not an effect of subsistence, whereas inertial properties are effects of subsistence. They're not
Mm.
conditions for subsistence.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's helpful. Especially kind of putting this framework, right, in the kind of top-down language like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah.
So how would you respond to the view that the first way shows us that there needs to be a first member who doesn't, but let me rephrase this, shows us that there needs to be a first member who doesn't derive its relevant power from another. So
Mm-hmm.
there needs to be a first member, right, that has the
Yeah.
relevant causal power,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't show us that it's not uh, a substance or member who isn't changed
Mm.
in some relevant in
Yeah.
some other non-relevant way,
Yeah.
right? So in
Yeah.
other words, why does this first member actually have to be purely actual,
Yeah.
right? So here I'm thinking, you know, you're saying that there's a first member in the series per se order causal chain. Well, this first member, um, the first member it doesn't derive its power, doesn't have derivative power from other members. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
At least in reference to, um, what it's relevantly causing, right? What it's relevantly utilizing that power for.
Yeah.
But it
Sure.
might be still caused in other ways, in non-relevant ways to the sort of power that it's non-derivatively possessing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So that was an objection that Paul Edwards brought up against Aquinas' reasoning here. Paul Edwards points out, look, the atheist is not denying that we have a first, all right? The atheist is denying the exalted status of the first, even in per se ordered series. So as you pointed out, you might have a primary in per se ordered series. Take the classical example, the mental agent who moves the hand to move the stick, to move the stone. That mental agent is primary with respect to the causality of that series. So it has the motion of that series per se, okay, in itself, and the rest all participate in it. But it itself is secondary in some other series. So it might just be primary relative to the causality of that series, but secondary to some other type of causality. And that's the sort of objection that Paul Edwards, put forward. And that seems to be, your objection here with the first way. Okay, look, maybe it'll be primary with regard to, this motion, but it could be secondary in some other respect.
Right. Exactly.
So it's not absolutely primary and thus not pure act. Yeah.
Right.
So there are a few points to make, first of all. So when it comes to per se series, the primary cause of a per se series possesses the causality per se, okay, through itself. So it has the causality of the series in virtue of what it is. It doesn't possess it through another. The members of the series which participate in that causality, they have that causality through another. The other that they have it through is through the primary cause of the series. So the members have the causality through another. The primary cause has it per se. When it comes to the first way here, the causality we begin with is that of motion. How does Aquinas analyze motion in the first way in terms of act and potency? So motion is the actualization of a potency. The causality involved then in motion is the actualizing of some sort of potency. The members of the per se series do not have the actuality of that series, okay, the motion series where it's actuality is what is in question. The members of the series don't have that per se, they have it through another, whereas the primary cause has that causality per se. Now, if the causality is that of the actualization, then the primary cause, which possesses that causality, doesn't have the causality of actualization through another, it has it per se. Now, what is it to actualize? It is to grant actuality. So if this primary cause, is a primary cause which can grant actuality and can do that per se, then it itself must be per se actual.
Right.
There's nothing. Otherwise, it would have its actuality through another. So it must itself be per se actual, and that is what it is to be pure actuality.
Yeah, I think that seems right to me. I don't know what do you expect in response to kind of just articulating the kind of metaphysics of motion and via potentiality, actuality sort of thing, and the sort of metaphysical scholastic principles that you just articulated now. What sort of response would you expect to hear back from in reference to your approach?
So generally, a lot of the confusion here resides in seeing the first way as a metaphysical argument. An argument for metaphysics is what we're dealing with is the metaphysics of act and potency, which is pretty much explicit once you get to the second or third line of the argument when Thomas analyzes motion. Because if you're the non-initiated reader, you might just be thinking, well, he's just talking about any sort of motion here. He's just talking about movement. Whereas if you're a more sophisticated reader, you're probably thinking Aristotle's physics. He's talking about change. But if you're, sort of the Thomas scholar, he's not talking about motion. He's not talking about change. He's talking about the metaphysical principles that underlie change. And when we tie this in with what he says elsewhere about the demonstrability of God, he holds that God's existence can only be demonstrated in metaphysics. You can't demonstrate it in physics. If you can't demonstrate it in physics, then the principles of physics, say the principles of change, are not going to be what get us to God. So Aristotle's proof of a first mover in the physics is out. It's not a proof of God. And Thomas recognized that. He saw that it had to be topped up by the proof from the metaphysics. And he talks about that in the Contra Gentiles, chapter 13. So putting all that together, we read the First Way as a metaphysical argument, and as a metaphysical argument, then it's trading in these notions of act and potency. So we have a per se, cause of actuality, in which case it can't have its actuality through another. So it has to be pure actuality. Other, sort of objections might be, well, okay, it may be per se actuality, but it wouldn't be pure actuality because it might have some sort of potency in it, which is unactualized. Okay, it
Right.
might have some
That's right.
unactualized potency.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if it's per se actuality, it is actual in virtue of what it is. If it
Mm-hmm.
had any potency that is unactualized, then it wouldn't be actual in virtue of what it is. There would be something of it which would be non-actual. So even if that potency is not actualized, it itself would still not be per se actual, even if it had some unactualized potency.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
So in being per se actual, then it is essentially actual.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So it can't
Okay.
even have any unactualized potency.
Yeah. Yeah. Changing up just a little bit.
Mm.
Let's imagine kind of a more bottom-up approach, right,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
metaphysics. So think
Mm-hmm.
trope theory or think substratum theory or something like that, right?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
let's kind of put on our more naturalistic hats
Mm-hmm.
here.
Yeah.
And let's say, okay, well, according to kind of, the naturalist's own view, which I take personally,
Mm.
um, if naturalism's the game that we're playing, kind of a bottom-up approach seems more consistent. But obviously,
Mm.
those feel free to, for those to disagree with me there. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so let's say that you're utilizing the first way when you're talking about, say, Oppie talks about a chair that's existing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you and
Yeah.
I, we both um, discuss more about this chair, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's imagine a chair, right? I'm assuming we're
Mm-hmm.
both um, are accustomed to sitting on those. So the chair on this kind of bottom up approach is dependent on its components, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say it's certain microchemical properties that need to be in place.
Mm-hmm.
That if we trace back the dependence down,
Mm-hmm.
we say, okay, well these micro properties need to be in place, and so they depend on such and such, right? You trace that dependence down.
Mm-hmm.
One might argue that we're only entitled to infer that there is an uncomposed component.
Mm-hmm.
Um, anyway, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll have a few wee quibbles first of all because
Yeah.
I don't think a chair is a thing that exists. I
Oh,
think it's made
artifact,
up of
sure.
several things that exist. Yeah. So I wouldn't use this metaphysics on artifacts, but like
Mm-hmm.
like it could be applied to say like a rock or a
Mm-hmm.
tree or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. So we analyze it down, and all we're entitled to say is that we have an uncomposed component. Well,
Mm-hmm.
sure. Let's say that we break everything down into its fundamentals, and we have let's say these uncomposed components, call them atoms. We've got these atomic components, right? Still doesn't tell us what the essence of the thing is. I mean, the essence can't just be the accumulation of all these different
Mm-hmm.
components, because the essence has properties and causal features that the components don't have. I mean, you
Right.
take a molecule of water has causal properties that hydrogen and oxygen don't have.
Mm-hmm.
And even breaking those down into their further components,
Mm-hmm.
they, even at the subatomic level, let's say we have further components until we do get to the uncomposed component, that isn't going to have the properties that a molecule of water has. Okay, but the molecule of these components go to make up the molecule of water, but they themselves don't constitute the essence of the
Mm-hmm.
thing. The essence of the thing is something different. So we need another principle of actuality which draws all these components together, and that's the form of the thing. It's
Right.
because hydrogen and oxygen they have are related in a certain form, H2O. They've
Right.
got this formal feature to them which the components don't have, and
Mm-hmm.
that essence is what exists to give us
Right.
the
Right.
molecule
So
of
that's
water.
assuming like a top down approach, right?
Yeah.
So
Well,
if we're assuming kind of a bottom up approach,
Well, I don't think it assumes a top-down approach. It simply points out that the bottom-up approach isn't going to give us,
Right.
the sort of causal powers which you need
Uh-huh.
for, for the essence, which
Hmm.
the essence can give us or the form can give us.
Uh-huh.
That if you just have these components right down to the uncomposed component, no matter how many of these components you put together, you're never going to get the unity that
Mhm.
form can give you. And
Right.
so that points us towards that sort of asks for something top down,
Hmm.
some higher principle of actuality which unifies those components.
Right.
Otherwise, you're continually going to have this problem of emergence.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. Well, it seems to me like you could also ask the question, why are um, like what are these uncomposed components, right? Like, are they
Hmm.
tropes? Are they um, quarks?
Hmm.
And then you just continue to ask the question, well, why are the quarks in this, need to be in a certain way that they're in, or why are
Hmm.
why are these tropes instead of other tropes, or why are these tropes in, just the
Hmm.
particular configuration that they need to be in? It seems like you're going to have to bottom out somewhere, even if we're sort of ignoring, um, uh, even if we're sort of endorsing that these
Hmm.
that there are sort of basic components. It seems like the questions that are still to be asked that
Hmm.
are going to require more metaphysics, so to speak. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would distinguish between explanatory dependency and
Mm-hmm.
metaphysical dependency. Um, and when it comes to explanatory dependency, yes, you do have to bottom out somewhere.
Right.
We can't go any further in the explanation, and what we bottom out at has to be self-explanatory.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also metaphysical dependency, and metaphysical dependency isn't asking about, what explains this and
Uh-huh.
going deeper to what explains that. Metaphysical dependency is asking, what accounts for the actuality of this.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're asking what accounts for the actuality of something, we're not saying, well, that has to bottom out somewhere. We're
Uh-huh.
saying, you know, is there some sort of principle that we need to account for this actuality, or
Right.
are these components, um, you know, can they themselves account for the actuality? And so my point here has been that, if we have some uncomposed components, they don't account for the actuality that the
Right.
things that they
Right.
compose have. So a molecule of water has certain causal features which the components don't.
Right.
There's an actuality there which those components can't explain, which means we
Mm-hmm.
need another principle of actuality, which is form. So
Right.
that's not kind of doing the sort of explanatory we bottom out somewhere. That's
Mm-hmm.
more the sort of the metaphysical regress, the more
Mm-hmm.
causal type reasoning that Thomas engages in. That's how I would go with that one, because
Right.
um, the naturalist can turn around and say, well, yeah, it bottoms out somewhere, but what makes your bottoming out in
Mm.
existence,
Mm-hmm.
kind of, better than my bottoming out in an uncomposed component? And I don't really think that's the issue here. I think that, we're trying to account for actuality.
Right.
And so we need a higher principle of actuality than just the components of a thing.
Right. Well, so what I was thinking was also kind of independence relation.
Mm,
And here you would have again the tropes needing to be configured, or the quirks
mm,
being the way that they are, and
mm,
it seems like obviously quirks or tropes would possess potency, and you'd have to
mm,
continue to tell a story. I guess
mm.
probably a little bit more what I meant by bottom out, not necessarily
Right,
just
right,
an explanatory dependence,
right.
but rather in some
More
sort of
metaphysical.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. All right, yeah, yeah. So I mean, when I hear bottom out, I'm thinking of OPE and the kind of the explanatory value
Hmm.
of our postulates,
Hmm.
and the belief that
Right. Yeah, in terms
bottoming
of the best
bottoming out.
explanation type. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. No,
So
that wasn't
bottoming
what I
out that
meant.
uncomposed components, which
Right.
are necessary in themselves, is just explanatorily better, you
That's
know.
right. That's right.
So that's it. So that's my concern. But I mean, the way
Hmm.
you articulate it, it sounds more like, what I'm after is what
That's right.
accounts for, the reality that we have in
Hmm.
front of us, and what sort of principles do we need for that reality. So I mean, yeah, I mean that sounds fine.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because I was just thinking about it, and it's like, no, even if you want to articulate um, um, uncomposed components, and the
Hmm.
best, I guess, theories would be either be tropes or quarks, something like that,
Hmm.
and they're full of potentiality. and I assume need to be configured in the right sort of way, or need to be addressed in relations with
Yeah.
other uncomposed components and so forth, then it seems like you're going to need to have more metaphysical dependence on something.
Yeah, on something higher, which
That's right.
unifies them.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So in your recent talk at the last American Catholic Philosophical conference there, you
Yeah.
argued for survivalism. Can you tell me
I did.
briefly what is survivalism and kind of the main argument you have for survivalism?
Yeah, I'm lucky I got out alive, didn't I? Huh? That was an interesting session. So yeah, I defended survivalism. So survivalism is the idea that the person survives bodily death. And it's a pretty niche sort of discussion within Thomism, but within Catholicism in general, because on the Thomist account, the rational soul certainly survives bodily death, but the rational soul is not identical to the person. The person is a composite unity of body and soul. So if only the rational soul survives, well, obviously the person doesn't survive. So the person corrupts. So survivalism is the view that the person does survive. Corruptionism is the view that the person doesn't survive. And, sort of this has sort of emerged recently. So some Thomists kind of, I think it was one of Stump's papers sort of kicked this off again, that the person survives bodily death. The soul is sufficient for survival of the person after death. And it was, I think Patrick Toner initially wrote some replies to this that, well, the person isn't identical to their soul. And if only the soul survives, the person can't survive. And thus kicked off the corruptionism survivalism dispute. So I defended survivalism in New Orleans. And I was thinking about the issue for a while. And so when the president of the ACPA got in touch, I thought, right, okay, I'll do this. It'll give me a chance to get my thoughts in order.
Right.
And what I noticed is that none of the literature around the issue, I noticed this, that none of the literature around the issue was dealing with an important metaphysical category that Thomas had called the supposit. Now, I noticed this and wrote my paper, and then I went and read a paper by Daniel Dehaan and Brandon Daum, which dealt with exactly the same thing and made more or less the argument that I made, right? Which killed me, like after I wrote the paper. And they were there at the the conference, so that was interesting. But anyway, all the literature up to that point, it hadn't looked at this important metaphysical category called the supposit. And for Thomas, the supposit is the existing individual, the existent, the thing that exists. And the supposit is a composed supposit. Setting God aside, anything which is composed is not there's a distinction between supposit and nature in anything which is composed. And this is because if it's composed, the thing which exists is not identical to any of its components. It's a result of the components. So in the human, its components are body, rational soul, and active existence. The body and soul compose to form the essence, and the active existence actuates the essence. And what we have is an existing thing, a supposit. Now, the corruptionism survivalism literature up to that point had been sort of arguing over whether or not the existence of the rational soul after death is sufficient for the survival of the person. But what I was thinking was, well, it's not just the rational soul that remains after death, it's the active existence as well. So prior to death, the individual supposit has an individuated rational soul and an individuated active existence. Okay? So it exists in an individuated style. It loses its body, but it doesn't lose its individuated soul or its individuated active existence. So insofar as the same active existence remains before and after death, the same thing that exists remains before and after death, though missing one important component, missing its body.
But the supposit is still the same supposit.
It's the same supposit, exactly, though missing something. And this is precisely because the same individuated active existence remains before and after. So if St. Peter is enjoying his active existence before death until he's crucified on the cross, and that same active existence remains after death, then the individual that active existence makes to be must remain after death, which is St. Peter himself. and not just the soul of St. Peter. And that was more or less my argument for survivalism, that because the act of existence remains, the same existence remains, but he's lost something, so he's incomplete. That should be appearing in the proceedings of the ACPA.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So yeah, well, I sent the document off in due time, so it should be appearing. Yeah.
What are you working on now? Why don't we close with that?
What am I working on now? I've got a book that I have to review, The Contribution of Cornelio Fabro to Fundamental Theology. I've got another book to review by William Desmond, so I've got a lot of review stuff that I'm working on. I am working on a few things. I'm trying to, yes, I'm delivering a paper critiquing Joseph Ratzinger's account of the person. The person is simply a relation, and defending the Boethian Thomistic account of a person as a substance of a rational nature, which can bear relations but is not identical to relations. So I'm critiquing Ratzinger's account of a person. I'm delivering this at a symposium and critiquing that. I've moved more into epistemology recently. I have been sort of working an awful lot on McDowell in the Pittsburgh School, and I think there's a heavy sort of conceptual connection between the two. And I want to use McDowell to kind of shine some sort of light on this commitment that Aquinas has, that being is what the intellect first conceives. So Aquinas said, he gets this from Avicenna, and he repeats that an awful lot, that being ends is what the intellect first conceives. And you could easily think about that in terms of, well, does the intellect form a concept of it, and then all its other concepts are derived from that? And I don't think that is the case. What I think is that when we perceptually come into contact with reality, our intellect is kind of turned on, like a stomach brought into operation. As soon as food hits the stomach, it starts digesting it. It doesn't digest it immediately, but goes to work on it. Well, the same whenever we just come into contact with being, our conceptual capacities are immediately just turned on and start going to work on being. And I want to give that, and that's a very McDowellian sort of reading, that, perceptual experience brings into operation conceptual capacities. So I want to use that to interpret Thomas, because I think that Thomas can be interpreted that way. Makes him much more relevant to a post-Kantian way of thinking.
I think you'd also enjoy Bonaventure. Bonaventure, I've been doing some Bonaventure research recently. It seems to have a similar sort of move found there, in reference to before you can know anything, it's your knowledge of pure actuality, right? You can't understand the things that come to possess act and potentiality without kind of the first member of your knowledge, so to speak, being pure act.
That's very Augustinian. That's very much related to that divine illumination theory.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so that would be a good interchange, because I would be reading Thomas in a much more sort of kind of traditional Aristotelian fashion there. That the agency of the intellect is brought into operation. So that's nice. That would be a good interplay. Right. Okay.
Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I look forward to next time.
Not a problem. Thanks very much.